Why are there not more people talking about the dark money that fueled the rise of the British Empire? Tonight, we're embarking on a journey through time, peeling back the layers of one of history's most powerful and controversial empires. The British Empire, sprawling across continents, ruling over a quarter of the world's population at its height, was famous for the saying, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." But just as constant was its appetite for shady deals, backroom negotiations, and financial trickery. Beneath the surface of royal pageantry and military might, the empire's true engine was dark money, vast sums of untraceable cash, funneled through secretive channels, fueling expansion, wars, and the relentless pursuit of profit. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the world's most successful and brutal business venture. From the East India Company's monopoly on trade, to the secretive banking networks in London, to the exploitation of resources and people across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, the British Empire was built on a foundation of creative accounting and state-sanctioned racketeering. This is a story of double-entry ledgers that hid fortunes, shell companies before the term even existed, and government officials who blurred the line between public service and private gain. The empire's accountants were as crucial as its generals, masters of numbers, loopholes, and plausible deniability. So, grab a cup of tea, ethically sourced if you can, and settle in. We're about to explore how the British Empire's financial wizardry shaped the world we live in today, and why its legacy of shadowy accounting still echoes in global finance. How did a small, rainy island on the edge of Europe transform into the world's most powerful empire? The answer isn't just military might or clever diplomacy. It's debt, mountains of it, carefully hidden behind the scenes. In the late 1600s, Britain was in crisis. The treasury was empty, the country was losing costly wars, and its rivals, like France and Spain, seemed unstoppable. The government desperately needed money, but raising taxes risked revolt, and traditional lenders were wary. The solution was radical. In 1694, a group of wealthy merchants and financiers proposed a new institution, the Bank of England. Its job? To print money and lend it directly to the government, bypassing the old limits on royal borrowing. This marked the birth of national debt as we know it. The government issued bonds, essentially IOUs, offering guaranteed interest to anyone who would lend money. Wealthy investors, eager for safe returns, snapped them up, creating a new class of financial elites tied to the state's fortunes. With this steady flow of borrowed money, Britain could now outspend its continental rivals. The government poured funds into shipyards, building a navy that would soon dominate the world's oceans. Wars could be fought and won on credit, with the costs spread over generations. The real foundation of the British Empire wasn't bricks and mortar, but bonds and gilts. This public-private partnership in finance and extraction allowed Britain to project power far beyond its means, quietly funding conquest and colonization, while keeping the true costs hidden from ordinary citizens. Over time, this system became a model for modern finance. The national debt grew, but so did the empire. Investors profited, the government expanded, and the machinery of empire rolled on, fueled not by gold or silver, but by the promise of future payments and the faith that Britain would always pay its debts. If you thought inventing a money machine was audacious, just wait until you hear about the East India Company, a corporation so powerful it blurred the line between business and government. This wasn't just a trading company. The East India Company commanded its own private army, at its height, over 250,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army itself. It had a formidable navy, a fleet of merchant ships, and the legal authority to wage war, sign treaties, and even mint its own currency. Imagine if Amazon or Google had warships, battalions of soldiers, and the legal right to annex your neighborhood or topple a government. That was the East India Company, an entity with the muscle of a nation-state, but the motives of a profit-driven corporation. Its primary goal wasn't governance or the welfare of its subjects. It existed to maximize shareholder profit. The company's directors and investors, many of them among Britain's elite, grew fabulously wealthy as the company expanded its reach. The company plundered India's resources, imposed crushing taxes on local populations, and funneled vast quantities of wealth, spices, textiles, tea, and silver, back to London. The riches that poured into Britain helped fuel the Industrial Revolution and transformed London into a global financial center. This was corporate conquest on a continental scale, a blueprint for empire that would be studied and emulated for centuries. The East India Company's rise marked a turning point in world history, showing just how far private power could reach when backed by military force and financial innovation. The empire's dirtiest secret? The transatlantic slave trade, a vast, brutal system that fueled Britain's rise to global power for centuries. Britain was not just a participant, but a leader in human trafficking. From the late 16th century through the 19th, British ships transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic, tearing families apart and subjecting people to unimaginable suffering. The profits were astronomical, enriching merchants, shipbuilders, and investors back home. The infamous triangle trade was the engine of this atrocity. British goods, textiles, guns, and alcohol were shipped to Africa, exchanged for enslaved people. These captives endured the horrific Middle Passage to the Americas, where they were forced to labor on sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations. The ships then returned to Britain, their holds filled with sugar, rum, and other commodities produced by enslaved hands. The wealth generated by this trade transformed British cities. Liverpool became the empire's slave-trading capital, its docks bustling with ships and goods. London's financial district flourished, as did banks like Barclays and Lloyds, which provided loans, insurance, and investment for slave voyages. These institutions built their fortunes on the suffering of millions. The ledgers and coins of the era tell a chilling story, one of profit and pain intertwined. The empire's wealth, its grand buildings, and its global influence were all underpinned by the blood money of slavery. Even today, the legacy of these secrets and atrocities continues to shape Britain's institutions and society. By the early 19th century, London had transformed into the beating heart of global finance. The city's wealth, much of it extracted from India and the profits of slavery, allowed it to eclipse rivals like Amsterdam and Paris. London's banks, merchants, and insurers became the world's moneylenders, funding wars, colonial expansion, and industrial revolutions across continents. The Bank of England, the London Stock Exchange, and Lloyd's of London formed the empire's financial core. These institutions didn't just serve Britain, they became the world's clearinghouse for capital, credit, and insurance. Investors from Europe, the Americas, and Asia flocked to London to raise funds, buy shares, and insure their ventures. Lloyd's, in particular, played a notorious role. It insured slave ships crossing the Atlantic and opium clippers bound for China, turning human suffering and addiction into lucrative business. The profits from these ventures were funneled back into London, enriching the city's elite and fueling further speculation. As the empire expanded, so did the flow of wealth into London. Every new colony meant new resources, new markets, and new streams of capital. The city's banks and brokers became experts at moving money across borders, financing railways in India, plantations in the Caribbean, and mines in Africa, all while collecting fees and interest. London wasn't just the empire's political capital, it was its money laundering headquarters. Behind the grand facades of Parliament and the city's imposing banks, fortunes made from exploitation were cleaned, invested, and multiplied. The city's financial system became a model for global capitalism, one built on secrecy, speculation, and the relentless pursuit of profit. Think slavery was the moral low point? Enter the Opium Wars. Britain had a trade deficit with China, so the East India Company, backed by the government, flooded China with opium grown in India. Millions became addicted. Silver flowed back to Britain, and when China resisted, Britain went to war to defend its drug profits. The resulting treaties forced China to open its ports, cede Hong Kong, and pay reparations. The opium trade exploded, generating huge profits for the British treasury and investors. This was narco-capitalism on an imperial scale. The empire's financial interests trumped morality every time. The British Empire state-sponsored drug dealer to the world. The East India Company played a pivotal role in this trade, acting as the primary agent of the British government in India. They cultivated vast fields of opium poppies, employing local farmers under harsh conditions. The opium was then transported to China, where it was exchanged for silver. This silver was crucial for Britain, as it helped balance their trade deficit, caused by the high demand for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. When Chinese authorities attempted to curb the opium trade by confiscating and destroying opium stocks, Britain responded with military force, leading to the First Opium War. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which imposed harsh terms on China, including the cession of Hong Kong to Britain and the opening of several ports to British trade. The opium trade continued to flourish, with devastating effects on Chinese society. Addiction rates soared, and the social fabric of the nation was severely damaged. Meanwhile, British investors and the government reaped enormous profits, further fueling the expansion of the British Empire. The legacy of the opium trade is a stark reminder of how economic interests can drive nations to commit morally reprehensible acts on a grand scale. What did the average Brit think? Not much, thanks to a masterful PR campaign. The empire's finances were hidden behind patriotic pride, propaganda, and cheap goods. The British public was fed a steady diet of imperial grandeur through newspapers, films, and public speeches. For most, empire meant glory, pink maps, and sugar in their tea, not opium or slavery. The average citizen saw the empire as a source of national pride and economic benefit, rarely questioning the darker aspects. Most turned a blind eye, enjoying the perks while suffering stayed out of sight. The harsh realities of colonial exploitation were kept far from the public eye, ensuring that the moral and ethical implications were seldom discussed. It was a masterpiece of moral and financial obfuscation. The true cost of the empire was buried under layers of economic benefits and nationalistic fervor, making it difficult for the average Brit to see the full picture. When the East India Company finally collapsed after centuries of exploitation and corruption, the British Crown stepped in, taking direct control of India in 1858. This marked the beginning of the British Raj, a new era where India became the financial keystone of the entire empire. The subcontinent was no longer just a distant colony. It was now the beating heart of British wealth and power. India's economy was systematically re-engineered to serve British interests. Vast tracts of land were converted from food production to cash crops like cotton, indigo, and opium, commodities that fed British factories and trade networks. Local industries, especially the world-renowned Indian textile sector, were deliberately dismantled through tariffs, bans, and outright destruction, leaving millions unemployed and dependent on British imports. The burden of this transformation fell squarely on Indian shoulders. Heavy taxes were imposed on peasants and landowners alike, often collected with ruthless efficiency. These taxes didn't just fund local administration, they paid for the very machinery of occupation, forcing Indians to finance their own subjugation. The British Indian Army, one of the largest standing forces in the world at the time, was almost entirely funded by Indian revenues. Indian soldiers, sepoys, were deployed not just within India, but across Asia and Africa, enforcing British rule and expanding imperial interests. The empire's global reach was built on Indian manpower and money. The systematic drain of wealth from India was staggering. Raw materials, precious metals, and agricultural products flowed out of Indian ports, while profits and taxes flowed straight into British coffers. Over the course of nearly 2 centuries, historians estimate that trillions of dollars worth of wealth was siphoned from India to Britain, fueling the Industrial Revolution and financing British expansion worldwide. This wasn't trade in any real sense, it was a one-way transfer. Indian markets were flooded with British manufactured goods, while Indian exports were tightly controlled and profits repatriated to London. Local economies were hollowed out and traditional livelihoods destroyed. India became the empire's cash cow, its credit card, and its barracks all at once. The subcontinent provided the raw materials, the labor, the soldiers, and the tax revenues that underpinned British global dominance. Every aspect of Indian society was bent to serve imperial needs. The so-called jewel in the crown was, in reality, a giant ATM for Britain, an endless source of wealth, power, and prestige, extracted at immense human and economic cost to the Indian people. The legacy of this exploitation still echoes today, shaping the destinies of both nations. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain into the world's factory, but those roaring machines needed a constant supply of cheap raw materials: cotton from India and Egypt, rubber from Malaya, palm oil from West Africa, and countless others. These resources didn't just appear, they were extracted from colonies through a system designed for maximum profit and minimum cost to Britain. Colonies were systematically transformed into vast plantations and mines, their landscapes and economies reconfigured to serve British industry. Local farmers were pushed off their land, and entire communities were forced into backbreaking labor, often under brutal conditions, to meet the insatiable demands of British factories. Indigenous industries, like India's centuries-old textile sector, were deliberately crushed by British policies. Tariffs and regulations favored British goods, while local craftspeople were left jobless. Colonies were forced to buy back finished products at inflated prices, creating a cycle of dependency and economic stagnation. Infrastructure like railways, ports, and roads was built, not to connect local communities or foster development, but to extract resources more efficiently. These projects were funded and designed to move raw materials from the interior straight to ships bound for Britain, bypassing local needs and priorities. For Britain, this was hailed as progress and development, a new era of wealth and innovation. But for the colonies, it meant deepening poverty, child labor, and the destruction of traditional ways of life. The wealth of Victorian London was built on the suffering and exploitation of millions across the empire. The City of London's powerful banks and financiers orchestrated and profited from this system, providing the capital for expansion and ensuring that the flow of wealth always returned to Britain. Colonial economies were locked into a web of debt and dependency, unable to break free from the grip of imperial finance. The Industrial Revolution's dramatic leap forward, its factories, inventions, and fortunes, was built on the backs of colonized peoples. Every yard of cloth, every pound of steel, every new machine was tied to the exploitation of distant lands and their people. While Britain prospered, millions in the colonies were trapped in cycles of poverty, hunger, and disease. The so-called progress of the empire came at a devastating human cost, a legacy of exploitation that shaped the modern world. By the late 1800s, the so-called scramble for Africa erupted. A violent, speculative frenzy as European powers raced to seize control of vast territories and untapped resources. In just a few decades, nearly 90% of the continent was claimed by foreign empires, redrawn on maps in European capitals with little regard for the people who lived there. European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and others, carved up Africa at diplomatic summits like the Berlin Conference, drawing borders that ignored ethnic, cultural, and linguistic realities. These new lines on the map were driven by financial interests, with investors and speculators in London, Paris, and Brussels eager to profit from Africa's land, minerals, and labor. Private armies and mercenaries enforced these claims, often with brutal efficiency. Figures like Cecil Rhodes, a British imperialist and mining magnate, built monopolies over diamonds and gold, amassing vast fortunes. Rhodes and his contemporaries used every tool at their disposal: political influence, economic leverage, and, when necessary, overwhelming force, to secure their interests and suppress resistance. The introduction of the Maxim gun, the world's first fully automatic machine gun, gave European armies a devastating technological edge. With this weapon, small detachments of European soldiers could annihilate entire communities, subjugating populations and crushing uprisings with unprecedented speed and brutality. Nowhere was the violence more infamous than in the Congo Free State, ruled as the personal fiefdom of King Leopold II of Belgium. Millions died through forced labor, starvation, and systematic terror, as rubber and ivory were extracted for European profit. Yet Britain's own colonial methods, forced labor, land seizures, and resource extraction, were often just as ruthless, if less publicized. For European investors, colonization was a high-risk, high-reward gamble. Shares in mining and trading companies soared and crashed on the news of new conquests or uprisings. Violence was not just a byproduct, it was a business tool, used to secure profits and protect investments. The scramble for Africa stands as one of history's most ruthless episodes of imperial finance, where the pursuit of profit fueled conquest, exploitation, and suffering on a continental scale. Its legacy still shapes Africa and the world today. The British Empire's system of wealth extraction was anything but haphazard. It was meticulously engineered, built upon a complex and highly organized financial architecture that spanned continents and generations. At its heart was the City of London, a global hub where bankers, investors, and government officials collaborated to turn imperial ambition into profit. The public debt market in London became the empire's financial engine. By issuing bonds, Britain could raise vast sums to fund its expansion, building railways, ports, and telegraph lines across its colonies. But these bonds weren't just investments. They were instruments of control. Colonies were often compelled, sometimes by force or legal manipulation, to take out loans from British banks, with the promise of development as the lure. These loans funded infrastructure projects that, on the surface, appeared to modernize the colonies. In reality, the railways, ports, and telegraph lines were designed to extract resources and facilitate trade that overwhelmingly benefited Britain. The colonies, meanwhile, were left with the debt, locked into long-term financial obligations that drained their treasuries for decades. The profits from these ventures flowed directly into the hands of Britain's financial elite. Aristocrats, bankers, and investors reaped the rewards, while the colonies bore the costs. The wealth generated by colonial labor and resources was funneled into London's banks, stock exchanges, and private clubs, enriching a small class at the expense of millions. Even in times of peace, the flow of wealth never stopped. Interest payments on colonial debts and dividends from overseas investments ensured a steady stream of money back to Britain. This system allowed the empire to profit from its colonies without the need for constant military intervention. Financial instruments did the work of armies. In effect, the British Empire operated like a vast multinational corporation. Its boardrooms were filled with powerful financiers and politicians. Its trade routes mapped for maximum profit, and its accounting ledgers meticulously tracked the flow of wealth from every corner of the globe, always upward, always toward the imperial center. The language used was investment, progress, and civilization. But for the colonies, the reality was a cycle of debt peonage, an endless obligation to pay back loans for projects that rarely served their own interests. The architecture of debt and profit was the invisible engine of empire, binding nations to Britain's financial system long after the flags came down. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world's balance of power was shifting rapidly. Germany, newly unified and hungry for influence, was transforming itself into an industrial powerhouse. Across the Atlantic, the United States was experiencing explosive economic growth, with its factories, railroads, and financial markets rivaling those of Britain. These rising giants began to challenge Britain's long-held supremacy in global trade, manufacturing, and finance. In response, Britain doubled down on its empire. The colonies became more than just distant territories. They were transformed into protected markets for British goods and vital sources of raw materials like cotton, rubber, and minerals. British officials imposed strict trade policies, ensuring that colonial economies served the needs of the mother country above all else. This strategy came at a steep human cost. Colonial exploitation intensified as British authorities raised taxes and demanded higher production from local farmers. Many communities faced mounting hardship, with traditional ways of life disrupted and local economies increasingly dependent on the empire's demands. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, but the machinery of imperial control pressed on. Meanwhile, the City of London remained the beating heart of global finance. British banks and investors wielded enormous influence, channeling capital across continents and shaping the destinies of nations. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks began to appear. The financial system that had powered Britain's rise was under increasing strain, as competition from German and American financiers grew fiercer. Germany embarked on a massive naval buildup, determined to challenge Britain's dominance at sea. The United States, fueled by innovation and abundant resources, rapidly industrialized and expanded its global reach. For Britain, maintaining its empire became ever more expensive as military spending soared and the costs of defending far-flung territories mounted. To keep the empire afloat, Britain relied increasingly on a complex web of financial arrangements, what some would call dark money. Hidden flows of capital, secretive banking practices, and off-the-books deals became essential tools for sustaining imperial ambitions. But as the demands grew, this system was stretched to its absolute limit, threatening to unravel under the weight of its own secrecy and ambition. The world was now a powder keg. The fierce competition between empires, the relentless drive for resources, and the hidden machinations of finance all converged. The stage was set for a catastrophic conflict, one that would not only shatter the old order, but also break the bank, plunging Europe and the world into unprecedented turmoil. World War I was a financial black hole, an unprecedented conflict that drained the British treasury at a rate never seen before in history. The costs of mobilizing millions of men, supplying armies across continents, and maintaining a global navy quickly overwhelmed the empire's resources. Britain, once the world's financial powerhouse, was forced to abandon its role as the globe's primary lender. Instead, it became a desperate borrower, turning to the United States for massive loans to keep the war effort alive. Wall Street, flush with American capital, became the new center of global finance as British officials negotiated for every dollar they could get. The empire squeezed its colonies for every penny and every resource: food, minerals, soldiers, and cash. Propaganda urged citizens to buy war bonds, and colonial subjects were taxed and conscripted at unprecedented levels. Yet even the vast wealth of the empire was not enough to cover the spiraling costs. By the end of the war, the financial center of gravity had shifted. London's centuries-old dominance was eclipsed by New York, as the British pound lost its supremacy to the US dollar. The world's financial system was being rebuilt, and Britain was no longer at its core. World War II finished the job. If the First World War had weakened Britain's finances, the Second nearly destroyed them. The Blitz devastated cities, and the cost of fighting on multiple fronts pushed the nation to the brink. To pay for the war, Britain shipped its gold reserves to North America, sold off centuries-old investments, and borrowed even more from the US and its own people. By the time victory was declared, Britain had won the war but lost its financial independence, emerging victorious but effectively bankrupt. In the aftermath, the United States emerged as the undisputed superpower. American leaders, eager to open new markets for their booming economy, pushed for decolonization. The British Empire, once the world's largest, was pressured to grant independence to its colonies, reshaping the global order. The decline of the empire was not just a matter of lost will or shifting politics. It was driven by sheer financial exhaustion. The treasury was empty, the debts were staggering, and the ability to project power had evaporated. The dark money that had once fueled the empire's rise, secret loans, colonial extractions, and financial engineering, finally ran out. The machinery of empire ground to a halt as the money dried up. In the end, the empire built on debt was destroyed by it. The financial strategies that once made Britain rich ultimately led to its undoing, leaving behind a legacy of both global influence and economic ruin. As the British political empire receded after World War II, its financial empire didn't disappear, it simply evolved. The City of London, once the beating heart of imperial trade, transformed itself into a global financial powerhouse, adapting to a new era where money, not territory, was the key to influence. In the 1950s and 60s, British bankers and policymakers pioneered the concept of offshore banking. They used the remnants of the empire, small, strategically located territories like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and the British Virgin Islands, as laboratories for a new kind of financial engineering. These places became tax havens, offering secrecy, low or zero taxes, and minimal regulation. These so-called secrecy jurisdictions allowed corporations, oligarchs, and the ultra-wealthy to move money out of sight. By exploiting legal loopholes and complex ownership structures, they could hide assets, avoid taxes, and launder profits with little scrutiny. Billions, eventually trillions of dollars flowed through these shadowy networks, often with the blessing of British authorities. The dark money that once fueled imperial expansion was now being recycled and updated for the 21st century. Offshore finance became a vital part of the global economy, enabling everything from corporate tax avoidance to political corruption and organized crime. Britain, and especially the City of London, became the world's financial butler, serving the fortunes of oligarchs, multinational corporations, and political elites from every continent. The city's bankers and lawyers specialized in creating complex structures to shield wealth from prying eyes and tax authorities. The legacy of the British Empire is not just in the countries it once ruled, but in the global architecture of secrecy and tax avoidance it left behind. Today, more than half of the world's offshore wealth is estimated to be routed through networks linked to Britain and its overseas territories. The sun may have set on the British Empire, but it never sets on a Cayman Islands bank account. The financial web spun by the City of London continues to shape the world, quietly channeling wealth and power behind a veil of secrecy. The British Empire's system of exploitation didn't simply disappear with the lowering of the Union Jack. Instead, its financial architecture and logic were woven into the very fabric of modern global finance. The mechanisms that once enabled the empire to extract wealth from its colonies, commodification of land and labor, the dominance of creditor interests, and the creation of complex financial instruments, have not vanished. They have evolved, becoming the invisible gears that drive today's economic order. These tools, once used to control distant territories, now underpin the global marketplace, shaping the flow of capital and the distribution of power across continents. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, established in the aftermath of empire, often echo the old patterns of colonial debt peonage. Through the imposition of structural adjustment programs and conditional loans, these organizations have, at times, forced developing nations to prioritize debt repayment and foreign investment over the needs of their own people. The result is a cycle of dependency and austerity that mirrors the financial subjugation once imposed by colonial powers. Today, multinational corporations, many with roots tracing back to imperial enterprises, continue to extract vast resources from former colonies. Whether it's mining, agriculture, or energy, the profits flow outward, while environmental destruction and poverty remain. In many ways, this is a modern incarnation of the East India Company, a system where foreign interests reap the rewards and local communities bear the costs. The logic of extraction and inequality that defined the empire's economic model is still with us. From the sweatshops of Southeast Asia to the oil fields of West Africa, the legacy of colonial labor exploitation persists. Protests against global financial institutions and multinational corporations are not just about wages or working conditions. They are a response to a centuries-old system of economic domination. The story of dark money is, at its core, a warning about the dangers of unaccountable financial power. From secretive offshore banking networks to the shadowy corridors of global finance, the same lack of transparency that enabled imperial plunder now facilitates tax evasion, corruption, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. The legacy of empire is not just a matter of history, it is embedded in the systems that govern our world today. The vast inequalities between nations, the persistent poverty in former colonies, and the staggering concentration of wealth are all symptoms of a financial order shaped by imperial ambitions. To understand the present, we must confront the ghost in the machine, the enduring influence of the British Empire's dark money on our global future. The British Empire, often sold to the world as a grand civilizing mission, was in reality a complex and relentless financial machine. Behind the pageantry and the rhetoric of progress, the empire's true engine was profit, driven by a web of banks, merchants, and politicians who saw the globe as a ledger to be balanced in their favor. From the manipulation of national debt to the ruthless narco-trafficking of opium into China, and the systematic exploitation of India's resources and people, the empire's reach was always about extracting value. The British state and its private partners engineered entire economies to funnel wealth back to London, leaving devastation in their wake. It was all about dark money, hidden flows of capital, secret deals, and off-the-books profits. Private greed fueled the expansion, while state violence enforced the rules. The costs, poverty, famine, and social upheaval, were pushed onto colonized peoples and the British working class alike. Socialized costs defined the system. The profits were privatized, but the suffering was shared by millions, whether in the colonies or in the industrial heartlands of Britain itself. The empire's wealth was built on the backs of the dispossessed, the indebted, and the enslaved. Its decline was as financial as its rise, marked by mounting debts, economic crises, and the unraveling of the imperial order. As colonies fought for independence, the British economy faltered, revealing just how much its power had depended on extraction and exploitation. The end of empire was, in many ways, a story of global bankruptcy, financial, moral, and social. The debts incurred by centuries of exploitation could not be paid, and the world was left to pick up the pieces. Yet, the ghost of that financial empire still haunts us. Today, the legacy lives on in offshore tax havens, global inequality, and the persistent concentration of wealth and power. The same networks that once moved gold and opium now move capital and influence, shaping our world in ways both visible and hidden. So next time you hear a romantic story of empire, whether in a novel, a museum, or a royal celebration, pause and ask, what's missing from the narrative? Whose voices are left out and who paid the price for that grandeur? Check the receipts of history. Look for the hidden costs, the unpaid debts, and the stories that don't make it into the official record. Only then can we truly understand the legacy of empire. Let's keep questioning the connection between wealth and power, because the story isn't over and the receipts are still being written. The shadow of dark money stretches across centuries, shaping nations and destinies. The British Empire's rise and fall is not just a tale of the past, it's a warning for the present. Every hidden transaction, every unaccounted cost, leaves a mark on our world. If we want a future built on justice, we must demand transparency, remember the forgotten, and refuse to let history's debts be erased. The true cost of empire is still being paid by all of us. The question is, will we keep looking away, or will we finally check the receipts?